Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Let me draw us all together. Tonight, we're very pleased to host Les Csorba, who is an author, CEO, coach, and partner at Heidrick Struggles, one of the leading executive search and leadership advisory firms in the world. Les previously served as special assistant to the president in the White House under George H.W. Bush, working in presidential personnel, and is a former board member of the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. A graduate of the University of California, Davis, Les is the son of 1956 Hungarian refugees. He and his wife, Anne, have been married for 38 years and have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. They make their home in Houston, Texas, and are members of Grace Bible Church, where my friend, Wes Brazelton, serves as the lead pastor. Les is the author of Trust, The One Thing That Makes or Breaks a Leader, published in 2004, and most recently, Aware, The Power of Seeing Yourself Clearly, which was published earlier this year. And Les does have a few copies of the book if you'd like to pick them up. They're $20, so you can either use Square or you could leave a $20 bill if you'd like to purchase one of those. But tonight, Les is going to talk about some of the content in the book and then open it up for Q&A. But specifically, he's going to unpack for us the gift of seeing yourself clearly and the importance of cultivating spiritual self-awareness. So please join me in welcoming Les.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you all for being here. We were here a couple of weeks ago, my wife Ann and I, for Sunday evening service, and as visitors, I can tell you we were refreshed by the wonderful spirit of worship and teaching, and so it's always good to be back here with you all, and I've always admired Jason and really value our friendship. One of the little joys of my life is to be part of a little Christian book club with Jason and a few of my friends. John Moon is here, and that is just such a joy, and I always appreciate and value Jason's insights and his wisdom. So like Jason said, if I may, I'm going to just share a few words and ideas that come from the book about self-awareness and spiritual awareness, and then maybe we could have some questions and a conversation. So just one of the ideas, of course, that comes from the book is about blind spots. The book is in part about blind spots, not the kind of blind spots that make driving dangerous, but the blind spots that slip into our leadership and into our relationships. And I would also argue that slip into our walk with God. My daughter, Molly, we have 4 kids, but my daughter, Molly, gets a shout out in the book about blind spots, not hers, mainly mine. Molly is the straight shooter in the family. She's very direct. She tells it like it is. I tend to be a little bit more the classic people pleaser. Some of us in this room are probably old enough to remember the classic sitcom Leave It to Beaver and the two-faced kiss-up Eddie Haskell. I'm a little more Eddie Haskell. Molly's a little bit more direct and blunt and tells it like it is. Anyways, about 15 years ago, she was going through driver's ed. And she got pretty frustrated with me because I was pestering her, as you would expect a caring father to do, to be careful of her blind spots when she was changing lanes and when she was parking. And so finally she got fed up and she said, "Dad, why do cars have blind spots? It's so stupid." And if you think about it, she had a point, and she was about 15 years ahead of her time, because today all smart trucks and smart cars have what are called blind spot information systems. With a little bit of an adjustment of the mirror, with utilization of the sensors, you can mitigate and eliminate blind spots altogether. And the same principle is true in leadership and in our relationships. And I would also say in our walk with God. With just a little heightened self-awareness, the courage to adjust, we can show up as the better versions of ourselves with our coworkers, our teammates, our family, our friends. The second point that I I'd like to talk about from the book is really the wisdom of self-awareness. I'm sure most of you in this room realize that the wisdom of self-awareness isn't anything new. I'm not breaking any new ground on the wisdom of self-awareness. The ancients for centuries talked about the wisdom of self-awareness. Socrates, remember, said to know thyself was considered to be one of the great aims of a virtuous life. Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman emperor, said that above all, be tolerant of others, but stricter with yourself. And of course, we know the psalmist David, over and over again, and especially in Psalm 139, he says, search me, O God, know my heart. So the wisdom of self-awareness is nothing new. This is a concept that has been talked about for centuries. What is new is we're dealing and experiencing historic low levels of self-awareness in our institutions. I would also argue in our relationships as well. About 10 years or so ago, I started to notice in the work that I do with corporate boards and with CEOs and management teams, an increasingly number of blind spots, lack of self-awareness. I noticed it among some of my friends, I noticed it amongst myself, and I thought, this is sort of interesting. What's going on here? Now, of course, that was my personal experience, and I really wanted to understand what the research said and what the data said, and so I started reading and read the book written in 2018 by Tasha Eurich called Insight, Why We Are Less Aware Than We Think We Are. Tasha Eurich, an organizational psychologist, collaborated with Harvard, and they did a study which showed that 95% of Americans believe that they're self-aware. But the data showed that only about 10 to 15% truly are. So you've got about 80% of people walking around who are deluded about their own self-awareness. And it kind of reminded me when the book came out, as Jason mentioned earlier this year in April for pre-order, I had a number of friends call and text me, and they said, Les, this is great. You're writing a book about self-awareness. I know exactly the right person who needs this book, right? And unreformed people pleaser that I am, I didn't call them out on it. But there was a little voice in my head that wanted to say, before you remove the speck from your friend's eye, you might want to consider removing the plank from your own. But anyways, it was a surprising statistic. Only 10 to 15% are truly self-aware. So I didn't quite believe that, so I asked our team at Heidrick Struggles, we're a global leadership advisory headhunting firm, and I asked our research team to look at our data, and a couple years ago, I think it was 2 years ago now, they looked at 75,000 assessments, leadership assessments. These are 360 reference reports, psychometrics across industries, across regions. Thank you. Anyways, so I asked our team to look at the data, and we looked at 75,000 assessments, and our data showed that about 13% of leaders are truly self-aware, which confirmed the data from Tasha Eurich. Now, I'm sure you're wondering why. How have we gotten to such historic low levels of self-awareness in our institutions, in our leadership? And I would also argue, and we can talk about this later, our relationships. My argument in the book, based on, I think some valid research and observations, is that back in the 1980s and the 1990s with the self-esteem movement in psychology, where everybody was validated for their strengths, when it was popular to win a trophy just for participating, right? There was that movement where there was just constant validation. That then morphed into what is known as the narcissistic epidemic, which Jean Twenge, the sociologist, has written extensively about in the early 2000s. Fairly or unfairly ascribed largely to the millennial generation. I don't want to overly generalize, but that's kind of where it came out of a lot of Jean Twenge's research. And then, of course, that morphed into the phone-based generation. the social media generation, the digital culture that we live in today, which I would argue the digital culture is the assassin of self-awareness, right? This idea, or not idea, it's the reality that we're constantly online, but offline from ourselves, less time for reflection. And the dopamine, the digital dopamine that is just sucking up our time for reflection, our ability to truly be self-aware, are all reasons why I think we see low levels of self-awareness. In the corporate world, I would argue, I would add in lack of feedback cultures, not enough feedback in terms of leadership. The other idea that I would share with you that I experienced in writing the book is that the book was really meant to be kind of a diary of a headhunter. My experience over 30, almost 35 years now, working with boards and CEOs. And it was meant to sort of opine on what I saw in leadership, and mostly, leaders overcoming blind spots and overcoming flaws and transforming into really, in terms of accelerating their performance. That was the intent, but God had a different plan. God started to work on me, and he started to convict me about some of my own flaws and weaknesses and blind spots, principally, which I've already talked about, people pleasing. If you think about it, is just another form of pride and selfishness, right? That's what it is. It's a manifestation of wanting to be liked and just being consumed with popularity in this world. And so he was working on me, and I really wanted to reflect on that and how I could show up better with my team and with my family, and especially in my walk with God, and just dealing with that other form of pride and self-absorption, which is people pleasing. Anyways, my sort of revelation, if you will, is that I couldn't ask readers to consider their blind spots and their flaws without first addressing mine. And so, in a way, it was a gift to me of seeing myself a little bit more clearly. Now, I want to share, I'm not going to talk long, by the way, but I want to share a couple of verses because these are particularly meaningful to me. But probably my favorite parable on spiritual awareness is in Luke chapter 12, verse 22. Remember, Jesus has gathered his disciples and the masses, and he is talking to them about worry and anxiety and fear, and really trying to teach them about being dependent on God and not dependent on yourself. And he says to the disciples in verse 22, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing." And then he says this, "Consider the ravens. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds?" I am sort of enthralled with this word "consider" that Jesus uses in this parable, or in the Greek it means literally to look with interest, to observe carefully, to ponder more carefully, to think more deeply. For what purpose? To become more aware, to become more spiritually aware. Jesus is saying in this amazing passage, ponder, reflect, slow down enough to see, essentially to wake up. And I just did the research. God uses the word consider or ponder 275 times in Scripture. And I just believe that throughout his teachings, Jesus invites us to a renewed self-awareness, not only of ourselves, but himself, and to grasp the amazing promise of his presence. If you think about it, Jesus' life and his teachings and his miracles flow from a profound awareness of the Father's will. You recall that Jesus is very famous for slipping away and praying and getting away from the disciples. He did that a lot in the mornings, but he did that many times during the day. And many think that was because he was pursuing spiritual discipline. I don't think it was out of just discipline or a quiet time, but out of a deep relational awareness of the Father's will for his life. And in John chapter 5:19, it says, "Truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing." And to me, Jesus models this moment-by-moment spiritual awareness, this divine awareness, which is very profound. One of the writers and thinkers on self-awareness that had a huge impact on me was Anthony DeMillo. Some of you may know Anthony DeMillo. He's an Indian Jesuit priest, died, I believe, in 1988. He wrote a book on awareness. And he has written extensively on this topic that to increase our awareness, we have to wake up. We have to wake up. We have to stop sleepwalking through the Christian life. That's essentially his message. And if you think about it, Jesus, when he says, "Consider the raven," that's a wake-up call. If I care enough to feed the birds of nature and the raven, how much more valuable are you? And it's my view that many of us, me including, are just kind of sleepwalking through the Christian life, unaware of the incredible riches of living more closely to God. So I was just struck with this question, as I was writing and as God was working on me. Wouldn't it be more easy for me to just drop the pride and the people-pleasing and the pull of the world, if I could just trust God and live in the presence, to grasp the promise of his presence and live in the reality of his presence, not by looking forward, not by looking backwards, but living in the now, in the presence and the reality of God. And living in reality hinges on our spiritual awareness, which I think is really the gift of seeing clearly. One more final story that I just love as it relates to self-awareness in Scripture. You remember the story of the road to Emmaus, the two disciples after the resurrection. They're walking alone. They think they're walking alone, but they're actually walking with somebody they think is a stranger, but it's actually Jesus himself. And the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, of course, they're disappointed, they're discouraged, they're disillusioned, they don't know what's going to happen to them. And Jesus is walking beside them. And they don't recognize him. They're completely unaware of his presence. And Jesus could have performed a miracle and revealed himself to them at that moment, but no, he asks them a series of questions. He asks them to consider, to ponder, and to reflect. And at one point he says, "Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And then in verse 31, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and then they woke up and they ran to the other 11 disciples and they proclaimed that he is risen indeed. I just love that story of spiritual awareness and what it means to walk in the presence of Christ. So anyways, tonight I hope you'll join me in embracing this gift of seeing yourself clearly. It's not just the gift of seeing ourselves clearly, but also the gift of being rooted in the reality of living in God's presence moment by moment. And just grateful for the opportunity, Jason, and would love to have a dialogue. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of things. There's probably not one single answer, but I think that the lack of feedback cultures that I alluded to earlier, a lot of businesses and corporations and organizations like to pride themselves on having an open environment where you can share anything you like, but the reality is that that's really not true, and that feedback really comes sort of once a year during a performance review, and so there's not that ongoing constant feedback. I also think that Probably, and I mentioned my own people pleasing, probably the number one blind spot in corporate America and in leadership today is people pleasing. And so there's sometimes this lack of willingness or courage to have the tough conversations. And so it's just hard for people to get feedback. I think the other principle that I see often is that leaders are so busy with executing tasks and trying to complete a strategic plan. They don't appreciate the importance of building a team, building a following, and making sure that you're surrounded with contrarians, that you're intentionally putting people around you who are going to tell you what you may not necessarily want to hear, like a sycophant who tells you exactly what you want to hear. And I have found that the best of the best leaders, at least in my experience, are the ones that are very deliberate about keeping it an open door policy, having contrarians around them who can push back, are the ones that can minimize those blind spots. Yeah, that's an important distinction is the way you convey that, right? I think some people, when they talk about the importance of being clear is kind, I love that idea that you need to be clear, which is the kind thing to do. But if you're clear in a way that is demeaning and is disrespectful, you're just not gonna, it's not gonna resonate. It's not gonna be effective. But if you can do it in a way where you might even actually reveal a little bit about something that you've done that you'd like to work on, or that kind of breaks the ice and builds a rapport, if you will, and a trust, then that feedback will land more effectively. So I love the way you asked that question. It's how you share that feedback is really critical. Yeah, this is such an important point. I mean, I do it with my wife Ann and with some other important people in my life. You got to give people permission, and you got to be willing to hear the feedback, even though it might be difficult to hear. I mean, I will tell you just one anecdote. I've made a big deal about the digital culture being the assassin of self-awareness, and I just see that in my life. And it's just so hard. I mean, there's so many wonderful things about technology and AI. We're constantly learning. It makes us more productive, efficient. But then there's so many dangers. So anyways, my wife has heard me go on and on about how dangerous this is. And the other night, I was so impressed with myself because I had this post on LinkedIn that I thought went viral, thousands of impressions and views and reposts. And she said, hey, if you want to be a self-aware guru, you might want to try some of that self-awareness medicine on yourself. So you need that, pushback from the people that you respect and admire and love. And you got to explicitly give permission to them to allow them to share that feedback. Yeah, such an important point. There's two types of awareness. There's internal awareness and external awareness. Internal awareness is your ability to understand your motives, your aspirations, your strengths, capabilities, flaws, and weaknesses. That's internal awareness. That's how you would score yourself in terms of internal self-awareness. The hard part is your external self-awareness, how you're landing, right? Because intent is not the same as impact. I may be intending to be empathetic and compassionate, but I may be landing differently. So you got to figure out how you're showing up externally in terms of self-awareness. You do that obviously by giving people permission to share feedback, by 360s, by just intentionally asking someone, hey, how did I show up in that meeting? Did I intended to land this way? Did I really land that way? So true self-awareness is both the internal and the external part, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just being smart and using common sense. You don't want to overshare or be overly transparent. Whatever. You just enough to make sure you're landing. And the way for me to do that is there's wisdom and the multitude of godly counsel. People if I'm dealing with something and I want to share something, I might go to them and say, hey, what do you think? How much do you think I should share? Is that too much? Is that too little? And so you got to have people in your life that you can have those conversations with. To use the word consigliere, but somebody like a moral consigliere, if you will, somebody who can speak and advise you on those sensitive matters, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, clearly you're interested in how we penetrate some areas of work specifically as it comes to
Yeah, I just think, and I mean, this is probably common sense, to this group, but I think it's worth repeating. The spiritual discipline of meditation, solitude, silence, reflection, which is, I think, increasingly harder in our culture, is something we just need to do more and more often. I am trying to do sort of the media fast, social media fast, and no scroll Sundays, and my wife is on me all the time. But I think the more time that we're alone and we're in prayer, meditation, solitude, I think getting away from on retreats, either by yourself or with a couple of close friends, I think is so important. We just don't have as much time for reflection, and I think as a result, by the way, the science confirms this. The neuroscience, our prefrontal cortex is like the living room of awareness and self and reflection and moral reasoning, and that's literally being robbed all the time, every single day, and it needs to be replenished. And I think the way it's replenished is reflection, silence, solitude, meditation. These are just basic common spiritual disciplines that are a fabric of our faith. Which is what we can return to. I mean, I can give you some high-profile examples and some just low-profile. Probably one of my closest friends in the oil and gas and the energy industry in Houston is a gentleman named Travis Stice, a very faithful Catholic. And he, 30 years ago, was an engineer at Burlington Resources. He was one of 4 engineers, and they were to be all promoted to engineering manager, and he was held back. And it was a stunning revelation to him and a surprise. And he asked for feedback, and he said, well, your reputation is you're using others to advance yourself. That was 30 years ago. When that blind spot was revealed to him, he made an effort to, from then on, be all about others. And to the point where he shunned any kind of publicity and awards, and he pursued the servant leadership model. Long story short, he founded a company called Diamondback Energy, and then recently stepped down as CEO and is now the chairman. And that company is about a $65 billion market cap company, and they created almost 1,000% shareholder value. So incredible. I call it a return on character. Where he just overcame this arrogance, if you will, and he developed himself into an incredibly powerful servant leader. The higher profile example that everybody would probably be familiar with in this room is the iconic CEO just down the street, Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase. About a year or so ago, or a year and a half ago, he took a real interest in the topic of self-awareness, and surprisingly took my call, and we had an interview, and he shared with me the story early on in his career when he took a work call from home. And he got on this call with one of his colleagues and became very angry and kind of used some language that he's kind of known for, that blunt, unfortunate language that he uses from time to time. And when he hung up the phone, he turned around and his middle daughter was standing there, tears coming down her face. And she said, "Dad, why are you so angry?" Well, needless to say, that was a defining moment for Jamie Dimon when he decided that he needed to show up with more empathy and sensitivity with his team, but also with his family. So I think there are other examples of that where, and by the way, I just love this idea, and this is an argument I make in the book, that the best of the best leaders do not view themselves as the completed finished product. And here's a guy who's, Jamie Dimon, 69, almost 70, he's been in the chair 20 years and he's still working on stuff. I came and met with him in April about the book, and it was like a week after this viral Zoom video was leaked. Remember when he was talking about virtual work, and he used some unfortunate language on that video, and he was telling me, he said, I'm not backing away from my position. If you want to work in a hybrid work environment, that's fine, but you can't do that at J.P. Morgan Chase for the most part. But what he did regret was, he says, I have a tendency to emote, I have a tendency to be emotional, and I need to clean up my language. And I just love the fact that here's a guy who's still working on stuff. And to me, that's the mark of self-awareness. Yes. Yeah, and I think starting, you don't have to be a manager of a lot of people or a leader of a large organization to start working on self-awareness. You can do this in your relationships. I think having the kind of friends that love you, but also love you enough to share the things that you may not see on your own is important. And I think that takes a maturity to be able to ask a friend, how you're showing up and being vulnerable and open and humble enough to take that advice. So you can start early, but then of course, throughout, a career, you should be constantly, never view yourself as the completed finished product. I mean, you're never going to conquer all the blind spots and all the weaknesses and the flaws. I mean, I think I've tamed the people pleasing. Like I'm actually more direct. I'm more intentional. I think of more opportunities. It's like working out. The more you use that muscle, the courage muscle to have those conversations, the stronger you get. But you're always working on it. Yeah. I think it's a fear. I think they're fearful of something, and they need to overcome that fear in order to summon up that courage. I mean, I know I keep coming back to people pleasing. I forgot to mention the reason why it's so destructive as a follower of Christ, and in trying to share your faith and making disciples. It's really a hindrance if you think about it, because you want to be liked. You're more concerned about how you stand with the world than how you stand with Christ. So for me, it's been amazing just to recognize that, because at this point, who cares? I mean, my motto is be bolder as you get older, right? But for many years, I think the thing that was holding me back was this, am I going to say something that's unkind or, too harsh, or am I come across as too self-righteous when I should just be letting God take care of that and just sharing my faith on how God has changed my life. Anyways, that's just how I would apply it spiritually. You're right. Yeah. 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 Yeah, no, they're effective tools. There's a lot of different ones. We have our own proprietary tools. There are other tools off the shelf that you can use. My only caution is I would never use one of those as determinative to make a decision, a hiring decision or a promotion decision. I would use it as just another tool, just like the interview is a tool, or just like how they manage themselves through a process is a tool, just like the references is a tool. You have to look at the totality of all that data, including the psychometrics that you're referring to. By the way, I have a self-awareness scorecard. It's 30 questions. It's on my website. I'm not saying it's conclusive, but it does give you a little glimpse of what your score might be. So,
Yeah, so that kind of leads into the question. Just there were two questions I have.
yeah.
That's one versus prices. So there's how do you define that? So you said, well, clearly there's a lot of quantity tools you use. It's not a binary. It's not a binary equation. So how do you determine that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so the best way to illustrate it is if you think about if you were to do a self-assessment, on yourself of how you show up on a number of different categories. We use META, mobilize, execute, transform with agility. Mobilize, series of questions on strategy and, can you mobilize people around, a vision. Execute, which is, task results oriented. Transform is being innovative, agility is resiliency and all that. Okay, so let's say you were to answer a bunch of questions on yourself. How do you show up on each of those questions? There's probably 40 of them. So then there would be a line of how you answered those questions, a little squiggly line. You ask the same questions of your peers, your supervisor, your subordinates. They then answer the same set of questions, and there's a line for them. If the line kind of tracks pretty closely, you're pretty self-aware. If there's a big gap in between those two lines, like severe gaps, then there's some serious blind spots. And what we do, which makes it so fun, is we sit down with a leader and do a debrief and show, what do you think about this? And if they were surprised, then that just is a further indication of a lack of awareness. If they said, yeah, you know what, that's true. So that we take that into account as well. But that's how you try to define. That's where we came up with the 13% number. Yeah. Yeah.
The other question I have is, so people teams, so anything that teams either over time.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. So it's to be self-aware is kind of reflection itself, what is expected.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be an actual movement over time. So that's not promising.
No. You're depressing me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm pretty optimistic. I feel like I just feel like this, for example, the current Gen Z generation. I think even though they're probably, there's some statistics that show that they're going to spend a third of their life on their phones, just based on hourly usage. There's also some data that shows that they want out. and they want more time reflection, solitude, and they're striving for something more meaningful, hopefully a relationship with God, and being more Christ-centered and having more purpose and meaning in their lives. I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about that. I also think that there's a lot of really great tools, and there's a more vibrant conversation around how we're showing up, with our teams and with our organizations. I think people are caring more about that, and so they're open to feedback. And so maybe I'm a little more optimistic. Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I had a friend and client. I did a book event right before the book launched, and I did a similar conversation. And he woke up at 4 a.m. was asking ChatGPT and Grok that question: why are we so reluctant to hear unfavorable feedback? What is it about us that resists hearing and seeing what we're not seeing ourselves? And I think, and we talked about that, and I think a lot of it has to do just with our pride, our human nature. We're just so enamored with how well we're being viewed, and I think that has a lot to do with it. There's just a resistance and a reluctance to hear the truth. I actually think it's extraordinarily liberating. I mean, because I was like that. Like, I just, I would be the kind of member of the team if we lost a pitch. I didn't want to hear about why. I just wanted to move on to the next one, right? But my colleagues started saying, no, we need to have an after-action review, and we need to go through and figure out exactly why we didn't win this particular pitch, and actually because you talk too much, or whatever, or you brag too much about your rep list or whatever it is. You just got to break that barrier, because it's so liberating, to me at least. Yeah. I go back to, it's kind of trite, but I love the quote from Anthony DeMello: what you are aware of, you can control. What you are unaware of controls you. I think that gets people's attention, because, gosh, am I unaware of something that's controlling me? And, so I try to share that and then talk about that a little bit. I think the fear of the unknown is also sort of motivating. So I don't know. I just think that might be another way to get at it. Great questions. It's a smart group. And then I'll come back to you right there.
I got past the microphone, so I'm going to sneak in.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here and for everything you're sharing. I read before coming here tonight that you're involved in a school in Houston,
Yes.
that you're a father and a grandfather. And at my company, we talk a lot about managing up, like giving feedback to people above you at work.
Yeah.
I'm curious too, at home and in your life, what role like intergenerational feedback could play in people who we might not expect to give us self-awareness, could help us see ourselves in a different way, maybe from children or.
Wow, this is such a great question. Actually, I'm writing a piece on the generational gap, and it's not so much the differences between generations, it's just the lack of awareness of the context in which we grew up. I think this question you're asking is so profound. It's like, I saw a study the other day, it's like the first time in history 4 generations are actually working together. Because baby boomers are retiring later, they're working longer. And then, of course, you've got silent generation, you've got Gen Z, Gen X, that's 4. And then, 5th would be the silent generation. Anyways, this study came out and said that is creating a lot of interesting dynamics in the workplace. because you got these 4 generations with different backgrounds and what they grew up with, and they have to learn to collaborate and get along. So, with that said, to the heart of your question, we have a lot to learn from each other's generations. A millennial may think that I, as a boomer, because growing up, the work ethic, and yes sir, and yes ma'am, and being polite, and working on weekends, and doing the right thing, these were prized sort of virtues, right? For a millennial, they may think, well, you're just workaholic, and then somebody in my generation may have this stereotype that a millennial is all they want is balance, and they want to work out, or they want this and that. So we have to understand the context in which we grew up and learn from each other, which I actually think will create an incredible collaborative work environment, and it hinges on awareness, right? The more I'm aware of the context in which Gen Z grew up, or millennials, and the more they're aware of the context that I grew up as a boomer, I think just creates more opportunities. That's my theory. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, wait, I think he was next. He's next, yeah. You don't need a mic, okay. Well, I just one of the consequences, obvious consequences, is just lack of growth and transformation. They're just going to be stagnant. They're just going to go sideways. Yeah. Well, I think if in terms of your relationships is what you're asking, like your relationships with others, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, they could be drastic and horrendous consequences if you have no self-awareness in terms of how you're showing up, particularly if you have a lot of power, and if you're a very senior in an organization. There's something that we call the CEO bubble, which, by the way, the higher CEO bubble, the higher you rise and ascend in an organization. You think you're more self-aware, but actually the opposite is true. Because you're getting less feedback, because everybody thinks your stories are more interesting, your jokes are funnier, right? It's like the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you know that in psychology. The higher you rise, the less aware you actually are. So you have to be even more intentional about figuring out how you're showing up. Anyways, I don't know if that makes sense or what. Yeah, that can happen. Certainly, that's a consequence. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would also argue that the most effective teams, the elite performing teams in history, based on our research, have 2 things in common, and they both hinge on awareness. They have an acute awareness of the mission of that team. Everybody around the table understands the purpose and the mission of that team. They're all on the same page. And number 2, they also understand and are aware of everyone's strengths around the table. If you get those 2 things right, you enhance elite team performance. We can talk about for hours all the great teams in history that did that. The Apollo 13 Command Control Center, they did that extraordinarily well. Manhattan Project. You can go throughout history and apply those 2 tests around awareness. Yes. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for your first book. You said around the world talking to us and how it affects religion.
You have? What?
Yeah.
Ma. That's shocking.
And so, look forward to this book.
Thank you.
So, with self-awareness, people are scoring you
Wow. So so you're talking about believers in the spiritual, Christian believers. Yeah. I don't think I've ever done that. That's an interesting.
Because you have the
Yeah.
believers score,
Yeah.
you have numbers where obviously your self-awareness is going to be wildly different.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like if you're in a business context and you're in an office environment and there may be believers versus non-believers. Okay, that's a good question. Well, yeah. Well, that's why you have a lot of raters. So you want to make sure you've got a robust set of raters, 10, 15, 20 different raters. And then the other thing that we really like to emphasize on those 360s are the comments. By the way, they're all anonymous. But the comments to me are richer, and that helps kind of get through some of the questions that you're getting at to really determine what are the motivations of a particular rater, whether he or she is a believer or not a believer, and how they judge you or not judge you. But that's an interesting one. No one's really ever asked me that. I have to think about that. Yeah. Yeah, the biases that may be involved, you know? Yeah.
I really enjoyed your stories. I was wondering if you could share a couple more, one or two more, of just times that you were surprised by awareness or spiritual gifts or gifts in the workplace.
Yeah. Just trying to think of some of the good ones. And I don't know if this is really spiritual, but I would say that the leaders that really have had an impact on me, some of the most iconic CEOs in the country weren't necessarily or didn't necessarily aspire to be CEO. They were almost sort of accidental. And to me, that does have a spiritual application if you think about it, because if we just, pursue excellence like the Apostle Paul tells us, and whatever we do it with excellence, and we don't have any aspiration for title, and there's just a genuine humility to serve your team and your shareholders or your employees, God's going to honor that. Probably the most high-profile example of that in terms of corporate America is the CEO of ExxonMobil, Darren Woods. In 2016, he was a vice president. The chairman and CEO of the company came to him and said, "We want you to be CEO." And he said, I don't aspire to be CEO, and I really don't need the top job. And they said, "That's exactly why you're the perfect person for the job." And he tells that story wherever he goes. And I see that a lot. And, I don't want to say that that's an overwhelming trend, but a lot of the CEOs that have this unique combination of a tremendous self-belief without the self-absorption, which to me is the best of the best in leadership, tend to be those ones that don't necessarily aspire for the top job. Yes? Yes. Yeah, I love the question because it's practical. You're already starting to think of ways of how you can leverage self-awareness, just not as just another skill, but a strategic lever to accelerate performance. Team performance, whether that's in a ministry or a non-ministry context, we all want to show up better and do better. But I think in the team context, I think just having more conversations about, I think one of the effective things when we lead team journeys, we ask people to go around the table. Maybe, there'll be one or two volunteers that will share their story and talk about kind of how they've grown through adversity and what they've learned about themselves and maybe some flaw that they've overcome or blind spot. And then that kind of gives courage for the next person to then have to step up and speak. And then the next week somebody else does. And then all of a sudden you're finding yourself really gelling and connecting as a team. And you're more aware of each other's stories and strengths and capabilities. And then I think you can really, really thrive. That's what I would do. You don't have to do it in one setting, by the way, just kind of over a period of time. Yes.
Thank you, Les. In the beginning of the year, there was this famous story of Coldplay concert and tech CTO and the HR representative, and
Yeah.
they shined a light and it sort of revealed their whole impropriety. But behind every catastrophic moment like that, there's like 100 mini steps that happened before. So,
Yeah.
in your experience, what leads someone to that?
Wow, that was probably the highest profile example of a blind spot in 2025. And the funny thing about it, I don't know if it's that funny, I can share it with this group. I immediately wrote a piece about it. And the book hadn't come out yet. It was about a month before the book, and I thought, wow, this is my opportunity. This is such a obvious example. But then I felt bad because, behind every story like that is just tragedy. The family and the kids involved. It's just really awful. But anyways, I wrote a piece, and Newsweek picked up on it. And what I didn't realize, I looked in our system at Heidrick Struggles, and I didn't see anything under Astronomer, which is the company that the CEO's with. But then like a week later, I found out that our firm was doing the search to replace that CEO. So I kind of stepped in it a little bit, and I was told to be a little bit more careful about what I write about. So my own blind spot. But that was such a high-profile illustration of just a lack of awareness, just tragic at so many levels. But again, I would argue, as you rise and ascend in power and influence, particularly in that top job, you think you're aware, but you're actually not. And that's probably a case of somebody that, was surrounded by people that told him what he wanted to hear, and somebody maybe didn't confront him on maybe, hey, you're having a relationship here that is not right. And I'm just shocked that no one ever called him out on it, right? Just how tragic. And it was, I think, 175 million views on TikTok that first week. It went crazy. It was everywhere. And I made the mistake of writing about it, and our firm was doing the search to replace it. Thank you so much. This has been so fun. Or did you, one more? Okay, yeah.
Do you think there's a genetic component versus a learned component to this, nature versus nurture? Are people born, is there a self-awareness gene?
I haven't, that may be the next paper I think we need to write or something. But I have been fascinated by the neuroscience of self-awareness, actually. And I wrote a piece on it with a colleague of mine who's a PhD in neuroscience. And it is fascinating to me that you can, based on our practices and our habits and the things that we do, can build self-awareness. And it's built in that prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of moral reasoning, reflection, and self-awareness, which kind of scares me because if you think about it, all that dopamine that's being sucked up by social media and the digital stuff. So I am interested in that topic, but I have no idea about what the genetic makeup of whether someone is inclined to be more self-aware than others. So. Yeah. 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 Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've been asked about this, and the research that we did that came up with the 13% number, we didn't break it down between male and female. I would be fascinated and interested to know a little bit more about that. I do think one survey that I mentioned in the book is that more women than men do identify themselves as people pleasers. They want to get along. They want to be a little more agreeable. I don't know if I'm making a generalization. I hate to do that, but I think that's what this one survey said that I cite in the book. But yeah, I'd love to explore that a little bit more. Yeah. Thank you, Jason. Thank you.
Well, great to have you. Wonderful questions, everyone. As I mentioned, there are books here for sale that you can pick up either with $20 in cash or you can use the Square. And then let me also just remind you that this will be the last Wednesday night school discipleship program for this calendar year, but we'll start up right again at the beginning of January on January 7th. Howard and Roberta Amundsen live in California. They are Christian philanthropists and art collectors. A couple of years ago, they put together a short film following in art and architecture the theme of the New Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Rome. And so on January 7th, we're going to show a screening of that film, Coming Home. The filmmaker and Roberta will be here to do Q&A afterwards. And there's also a number of photographs that were taken along that journey, which will be on display, and a little performance as well. So save the date for January 7th at 7 o'clock, and look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for being here, and happy Advent.